still my... Welcome to Speak Sex. I am your host, Eurydice, and today's episode is about God and the body and womanhood. And my guest is Rene Steinke. She's a novelist, an American author of 3 novels, The Fires, Holy Skirts, Friendswood. Welcome to the show, Rene.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, Eurydice.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad we're doing this. Yeah. So you and I have had conversations, through the many years about, different aspects of this topic because we're both feminists and we're both aware of like the religious impulse and respectful of it, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I think our work is, defined by that search as well. The sense of like the artist as a shaman or priest or, revelatory being or vessel, right? And the sense of like art as the kind of crucible where we can, people can alchemically melt into one, right? Which requires faith and trust. and we live in a moment where there is, like a huge deficit of trust. So,
that's just so beautifully said.
Yeah, well, I was thinking I wanted to start with this feeling that I have that the 21st century like began with 9/11 basically, and has proceeded, to go through like landscapes of death, right? So that are only mitigated by like the illusion of mass culture, right? But we've gone through a lot of war, a lot of like elective war, as we say, elective surgery. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and many other places. Which war that has caused a lot of migratory change and social upheaval. So like 9/11, then all the wars, kind of maybe in response to it, and then straight from that. COVID-19 and that landscape of death and uncertainty, and then war in Ukraine now, which is like Europe, which feels to those of us who are more Eurocentric, like even closer to nuclear war. And in the middle of all of that, we keep like mitigating the shock that is like death and mortality, which is like the shock of our consciousness, through dream states, right? Through like the blockchain and NFT and like the internet. So...
the religious impulse has to go somewhere, right? Like the...
Right, so like it's like it's like pre-enlightenment in all those past centuries, humans like invoke the gods or the saints, for help, and they, hoped for redemption in the other world, hoped for like spiritual, transformation, like through all, for some form of magic, and the religions changed from the more natural to the more like Abrahamic. But basically, we've given that up. I think like with the industrial age, and now like magic has been transplanted by science and math and commerce, and it's a poverty. I feel that we are in like a civilizational decline as a result of that. So what do you think?
Well, I guess I've been really noticing, especially in the past 2 years, a real hunger for spirituality that seems to get expressed in ways that seem to, I mean, because so many people have been wounded by their upbringing in the church, or just by, or they just have issues with some of the terrible things the church has done or other religions have done. I'm speaking, since I was raised Christian, I'm going to have to speak from that center, but so I don't want to speak for other faiths, but certainly there's a certain distrust of institutional religion. And a lot of people, like a lot of people say, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? What does that mean, really? I'm spiritual but not religious. And there's, and I'm not I don't want to dismiss all of these attempts, but I'm not dismissing them at all. I think they're very earnest, but there's a way in which they seem to be some things, such as, meditation, for instance. Corporations are now, sometimes because they understand that meditation and quieting the mind and trying to be in touch with something other than oneself, some kind of energy other than oneself, is helpful for a person. Corporations are using meditation in their, workplaces, and so there's a way in which some of these practices are getting completely divorced from any kind of tradition, and I'm interested in that. I wonder about it, and I also think about some of the, when I was young, when you and I were younger, there was a lot of satirizing things like horoscopes and the practice of looking to crystals and thinking about color, thinking about, there's a lot of satirizing of these kinds of, you use the word magic. I don't know if you would use that word to describe these things, these practices, but ways in which people are searching for some kind of link to some kind of spiritual energy, let's just say. And now I think that people aren't satirizing those things so much, but there's a way in which they just seem to be kind of floating out there. Do you know what I mean? Just kind of, they're kind of almost like a mosaic, and in a kind of chaotic way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that people are really hungering for a kind of way to make meaning out of all of this death that they're experiencing, all this grief. Mm-hmm. And now with the Ukrainian war and COVID and many other things going on, it can feel overwhelming. To be able to take in what's happening in the world and deal with just being human, all the things that are just hard about being in the world. So I've been thinking about this, and I've just been thinking about what happens to the religious impulse, and where does it go when the institutions aren't working anymore. I saw on the internet last week that a church, I think it was a Methodist church, I'm not positive, but a church had a gun on the altar.
No.
Yeah.
The Church of Guns.
I just found this horrific, Yeah. So, I guess at the same time, there's this, clamping down on dogma in the churches, in some churches. That's really
Well, it's
hard.
an interesting dilemma because, on one hand, I'm first generation and I've stayed in America because I came from a very, fanatic monoculture, right? So everyone was an Orthodox Christian. My grandfather was a priest, as your father was a minister. But
Right.
the big difference is that we didn't get Luther, we still had like the same ancient Byzantine and as we do now, the same like ceremonial robes that the Byzantine emperor wore, were worn by my grandpa, like on the island of Lesbos, right? So all of the customs, the words had remained the same. I mean, I have from him books from like, 1610, right, with like
Wow.
blessings to be read. So there is of course in that continuity there is a beauty and power of identity, which in America we seem to like be hungry for, but on the other hand it's very oppressive because the individual just feels out of voice or choice. So for me, like when I came here, it was so liberating and exciting and beautiful to see how many churches there were and how different and how anybody could basically, any group of people could basically start a church, and like it was, the yogis had churches and, there were Christian churches of any imaginable thing. And that was the reason for America, in a sense, right? The first, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and many of them originally came for religious freedom more than for economic, success, which we have come to misunderstand, But I think that the two, so what happens in America is the other extreme. Everything gets fractured and it gets, it becomes too quickly, because it lacks like that profound rooting, system. It gets very quickly like, commercialized or, monetized or, it becomes pop. And I think once again, we're looking for new meaning, in the Eastern religions or in the evangelical, because you want to be born again, because like the institution that you were following, and up to now seems very sclerotic, but then they become sclerotic. And then, it's just kind of like as soon as you give them power, they seem to take it, which is, at least in the Christian tradition, like, the opposite of what Christ preached, and we all know that. But no one is really able to stick to it.
Right. That is a real quandary. I mean, I do think in America there is a tradition of rootedness. Yeah. And there is a tradition of openness, even. Some Christians. My father was more of the progressive kind of minister, more the progressive kind of Christian who really looked to, the radical side of Jesus and the open part of his message and the embracing part and the, not the homophobic, not the opposite of homophobia and the opposite of anti-woman. But I do think that tradition, insofar as it exists in America, doesn't get portrayed very much in the common parlance of the media, because it's not making news. It's not fighting. It's not aggressively fighting things. It's just people trying to do the best they can to help others here and there. It's not a coordinated, dramatic. I shouldn't say it's not coordinated. It is coordinated, but it's not dramatically, dogmatically stating things like, we don't believe women should have control over their bodies, or we think people should have guns. It's not dramatically connecting to this politics, which is actually anti-Christian. So it doesn't. So there, I do think it exists, but it's a lot of people don't know about it.
And what do you think,
immediate.
like, what's the place for feminism in that?
Well, there's something now I'm not an expert on this at all, but I've been trying to read more feminist theology.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think there are one practice in feminist theology, for example, is to think about all of, so the scriptures were put together by men, right? So, and, we have all of these scrolls, right? We have all of these ancient scrolls that had various accounts of Christ's life. You've heard of the Gnostic Gospels that,
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we have all of these, and, what was included in the canon was decided, of course, by men. So what does that mean in terms of the shape of how we see things? And, for example, there's a Gospel of Mary Magdalene that I read recently. There are more copies of that Gospel than I think any other one, but it didn't make it into the canon. It also supposedly is, I don't know if this is true, but I read that the first few pages of that Gospel are torn out in every single copy.
Wow.
Which I find really interesting, really fascinating.
Yeah.
And then, but just in terms of the practice of thinking about, there have been things like using non-gendered language for God. There's a practice of thinking about all of the silences in the stories where, there might be a woman present, but we don't know what she said. But, imagine, in order to fully think about the place of women in those stories, we may need to imagine
Mm-hmm.
From the context and from what we can find out, what they would have said, what they might have said,
Mm-hmm.
What their perspective might have been. And I find this really fascinating. And of course, now I think there are more female ministers in the Protestant tradition. Anyway, there are more female ministers probably now than there ever have been, or I should say female identified.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also people who identify as trans who are ministers.
Mm-hmm.
And that is going to change things, and I also think, ironically, one of the reasons why that's happening is because it's not a profession with a lot of as much respect and prestige as it used to have. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a place where women can
Mm-hmm.
make their, more easily enter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that, religion, if it's not going to be institutionalized, which like I equate with corrupt and oppressive, it has to be, rebellious. It has to be almost transgressive, right?
Right.
Or heretic.
Right.
So, and it's kind of like this how the cycle works. I think it's time for a scapegoat.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Who will like I mean, not necessarily one person, but who will appear to be one representative of some sort of movement of people who have profound religious needs and pure religious needs, and will reclaim faith again, in some way. And what we do, as a culture, as not even a culture, like as a pack, is we cleanse all of these. We're now under extreme pressure, right? So we have had the thesis, and now we've broken into so many antitheses, let's say, if I could say that, in terms of culture. And I think that the way for us to synthesize will be painful, and that's how transformation works. Transformation hurts. Like, read Ovid. So sooner or later there will be a prophet, if we want to use those words. But those are Judeo-Christian words, so I wasn't, I'm not necessarily like thinking that specifically, but I do think that we're going to rediscover our, like worship and, and faith soon.
Outside
the
outside of institutions, it sounds like
that we know,
like
right? That we know, and outside like the names that we know. But I don't know, Yeah, it's and I think that we'll recognize it, right? Because right now there is just such a mess. It feels to me very much like the breakup of an empire, which has happened a few times before. And so, I think that like as a civilization, we're in shock, And I think that there is a place for art in that, because I think like the genius of art is this kind of like revelation that like, the contradictions don't exist, right? That the contradictions are just like in our minds, in our perception, but not actual, right? So I do think that like religious people and creative people, are kind of like at the forefront of this, and this, and there's a lot of talk, like even when you look around at like life coaches or
yes,
everybody's talking about like transformation and alchemy, and like everybody's trying to find a path to change. So there's a big hunger for that.
Yeah. A lot of that language, I guess, seems like repurposed language from the church and kind of sanitized. And sometimes it gets corporatized in a way that makes me very uncomfortable. But I mean, I'd rather be, if we're going to choose institutions, I wouldn't, well, maybe I shouldn't put it that way. I just, if there has to be an institution, I'd rather choose progressive, flawed church to a corporation, if we're going to have to put this in some kind of institution. But I have been thinking a lot about the relationship, because art really, forces you to remake yourself, rethink yourself, re-see things, ask questions, right? It's the opposite of dogma, right? It's propaganda if it's dogma. And, what is, insofar as religion is about making meaning, what part of that is asking questions as well? What is that? What part of that is related to art? And I don't know if you can. I don't even know if we could put it into words. But I told you that I'm really interested in this artist Hilma af Klint, who her dates are roughly late 19th century. I think she died in the 40s. And some people think she was truly the first abstract artist. And she was involved with Rudolf Steiner and Theosophy, but she was also a practicing Christian. She didn't see a contradiction there. But one of the ways she got to abstraction was, and she was frustrated with institutions. And she was a successful artist doing, more naturalistic kinds of work. And she was, she'd do botanical drawings and things like that. She did illustrations for botanical texts. And then she got very interested in theosophy and she was doing seances with these other women who were called the Five. And the spirits just told her what to paint. She felt like she was truly just getting this, she was just a medium and it was coming through her. And that changed her art. That's when she started making more abstract art. And, you can see symbols in it. There are some religious symbols from various cultures in her work, but it is really amazing, like very mysterious and beautiful abstraction. And she was not able to show it in her lifetime. People thought it was, people weren't interested in it, or maybe they thought it was beyond the pale. Or maybe it's just because she was a woman, so she was dismissed. Mm-hmm. But she thought that she towards the end of her life, she said, I don't want it. She gave up and she said, I don't want any, my work is too early. I don't want it shown at all until at least 20 years after my death. Seriously, like I'm making paintings that are for the future.
Wow.
Nice. And one of the chilling things is she drew a spiral study of the place where she wanted to eventually show her work. I guess before she decided that it was, way too early. She was way before her time. She drew this, but she drew this diagram of a spiral building. And the first major show, or, the first, I think, huge show of her work was at the Guggenheim in New York City a few years ago. And what is that building but this spiral, So it's kind of...
prophetic.
Yeah, it's prophetic. And I think it was a huge show. I mean, it was very big in New York, but I think it was partly because of this spiritual hunger that we were just talking about. It was during the Trump administration, and I just think it was totally, probably the biggest show in many years here. And she was, before that, just sort of like an artist, not as many people knew about her.
Yeah, no, but I think that for many of us, we're not that maybe disciplined with it, but many experimental writers and artists, use, use downloads basically, where you are a vessel and you access I've worked with like tarot cards where the tarot tells me like how to structure the writing, or I definitely think that like embroidery is a meditative practice, where you can even like hem, like blessings in the. That's what my ancestors did. So in the stitch, or the incantation, the incantatory writing. I mean, like look at Ginsberg. Ginsberg was my teacher at Naropa, and then Anne Waldman. Really? And it's all incantation,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's here. It's just we don't do it in such an official. Like she was able to say, or at least the people who described it were able to make that direct connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this is interesting to me. So your ancestors, when they did embroidery, would almost like saying the rosary. They had.
Yeah. Well, the women. So only women did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. My grandmothers were very, very much into embroidery, and my mother a little bit. I mean, that's that's a really beautiful. I think it's just a really beautiful thing that you are reclaiming, and the way you are reclaiming it in your work.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm doing it. Like it was very much. I didn't have like a what's the word? Like an innate urge to stitch, but I did begin. When I became pregnant, and I felt that calling, because I remembered my grandmothers. I would stay with, I would be on the balcony with them, and when there was no work, we would sit there and stitch and talk, and also like pray, like say psalms, basically, not pray, just like
Wow.
repeat the psalms. And hours went by, and people would walk by, and it was a way to kind of like count time, So I felt, when I was pregnant, like time had slowed down so much, and it was a way to like accept that instead of, try to like control it with my like more masculine habits of time, which were like get things done, even though like my body was like really getting bigger things done. But like I was not a natural, like I enjoy drawing much more clearly, but it did help me slow down. It did. I realized in the process, and that's why I kind of stayed with it, that this teaching forced me to like slow down and get out of like the time of this culture, basically.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, in that sense, it still is more like of a like spiritual practice, let's say, than like a job,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I feel about writing most of the time too, or writing novels or stories.
Yeah.
And you go to this place where time just kind of vanishes.
Yeah.
Or that's the ideal anyway. And usually the writing goes better when you can get to that place. But if you can't get to that place, you try.
Yeah. And it's like out of body, and well, that's the, it's like trying to access the universal, condition or consciousness
the place that has more intelligence than your conscious brain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something else I've been thinking about more and trying to learn more about is Jung, and so I guess he would use the word the collective unconscious for that. But I have trouble with Jung's binaries. I don't think I want to learn more about how that works, but does the collective unconscious have these binaries within it? Do you know what I'm saying? And that's obviously one really exciting thing that's happening now as we're breaking those down. And so what does that mean in terms of Jungian thought? I don't know. Something I'm curious about.
Yeah, I'm on the fence about all of that, but it is very recent, so I don't know. I really am on the fence. My I don't have a solid view. I began with like so super excitement over like gender non-binary and gender bending, and I was like, oh, I was body dysmorphic when I was even a teenager, so I wanted to be a boy, dressed as a boy, had a boy name, I pretend to be a boy, because I
didn't
kind
know
of
that.
like so I understand, and it was very exciting, like the first time or the first few times that I learned the span of our pronouns, and clearly I was like, oh yeah, I want that one or that one, but I'm not really convinced about the medicalization of it. So, no, I'm not at all convinced about the medicalization of it. So I do have like, it continues to be a dilemma for me.
Oh, I just think that sometimes it can be life-saving. I think it can be life-saving to have the medical intervention. Yeah.
Yeah, well, life-saving from the point of view of like mental health life-saving. So
Yes.
of course none of us are talking about like, having a fatal illness. We
Mm-hmm.
are talking
Mm-hmm.
about the mental disease, let's say, or sense of whatever,
Yeah.
but again, like my question is, because I think that we are in a generation, well, I definitely, because I came from like an old culture, right, where nothing
Yeah.
changed. So people were
Right.
like, working the land, and my grandmas like, were only black and followed their husbands and called them my master, right? So like,
Wow.
my mom,
Really?
my mom never had a
Wow.
job, never had a bank account, never drove to this day, right? All of that. So
Wow.
I seem to, I'm like at the intersection almost of like, the 40s and now, and all of these, let's say developments. I don't call them developments, but all of these scientific developments have happened all at once. Yeah. So I do wonder why they happened. Post like nuclear threat, right? So we were almost on the brink of like nuclear suicide, and then there is this explosion of like technologies that are getting into the body. So yeah, I am just interested in the phenomenon. If when I was 14, if this had been available and discussed, I would have changed for sure. I mean, as I said, I had a complete, I hid my groin curves and dressed only as a boy. I actually shaved my face, hoping that like I would grow a beard and then I could get into Mount Athos, which is like this monastery that only men were allowed to go in. I mean, and I'm sure looking back that a big part of it was that I didn't want to be associated with my gender, well, my birth gender, and my dad had always encouraged that, right? So my dad would be like, let's leave the women and children behind, and you and I go on our, adventures. And so he treated me as his son. He didn't have one.
Right.
And then his friends did as well. So I was always hanging out with the older men, so to speak, including like the male teachers when they started having. So I think I kind of like was shocked when my body, without my like consent, started developing in ways that made me like a hot chick on the streets. And it was just, it made no sense to me. People would like catcall, this is Greece also. There was a lot of like response to, to like, whatever, physical attraction. And it was very discombobulating and disconcerting and confusing and painful for a long time. At some point, I came to understand that I could use that to get away from my dad. That, I had so many other takers, whoever they were, right? That I could just like get him to emancipate me and leave home. So my attitude toward it changed some, but it changed only through alienation, right? So my attitude changed because I was no longer my body. So I could kind of like use this body that I didn't identify with anymore, use this like sexy, attractive, whatever it was, to no longer be a kid and acquire like some other sort of some other sort of like value for myself and sense of identity, right? But it did take me another, like, at least decade or more. I think that it was only when I conceived, unexpectedly, that I understood, like, my gender, and I embraced it, and it made sense to me. And, I've been in peace with it ever since, in great peace with it ever since. But it made, I understood it, like, profoundly, right? So what I'm saying is I probably, none of that, like, I would have taken advantage of everything that was available at that age. And I don't know whether it would have served me, whether, it might have prevented, like, a lot of, anxiety and depression and mental suffering, but does anything? I mean, there can always be something else that we clash with our culture and suffer as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sympathetic to what I've seen some of my students and other people go through.
And so do you think that we're moving into, how do you think that's changing our society?
You mean just the whole array of genders that we are now thinking about, or that we're now finally recognizing? Is that what you mean? Or
no, I mean more specifically the changes,
the actual
biomedical, the hormonal and surgical.
I think maybe it's emphasizing the relationship between the mind and the body. Just a kind of, I think there's a kind of, at least in this part of the country, where, I live in New York City, so I recognize this is not all of America, but in New York City, there's I just think there's a much broader acceptance of all different kinds of expressions of gender. And
so do you have a sense that, like, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, this will have changed our, like, humanity in a certain way, or you don't?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. That's sort of not. Will it change our humanity? I don't know. I think humanity in some ways, there's a lot of things that stay the same. But I think that it's a great thing that young people are thinking in this very, very open way about gender and sexuality. People, our kids' age, I think that is very liberating and healthy. I guess I think that as a feminist, I don't want to be defined by my body, and so I want other people to be able to, have their own self-definition as well. I think that's where I come down on it.
Interesting.
But it's certainly shaking up things in certain parts of the Protestant church in interesting ways too. I think the whole redefinition of gender, or the different way we look at gender, is really shaking up all kinds of paradigms and ways of looking at things that we've had in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the binary, I think one thing when I was talking about the collective unconscious and Jung, so much of that framework is feminine, masculine, right? A lot of dark light. There's a lot of binaries that kind of go into the understanding of fairy tales and myths and religions. And I just, maybe I've changed a lot, and I find that binary sometimes not as helpful, or not as meaningful, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So, I find myself when I'm reading something or listening to something that is in that Jungian framework, well, what you're saying, this is the masculine side. Well, what is it? The animus, that is the masculine. Well, what does that really mean?
Mm-hmm.
What is it? The anima? I can't remember. But it's definitely the masculine side. There are things that are identified with those two genders, and it made me wonder about: are there any queer Jungians? Is there a queer Jungian school? I'd be interested to know.
Yeah. Another part of it is that there is a running debate in the feminist movement, about the third wave and where the third wave of feminism has taken us. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're in different, we have different points of view. And that may be simply that you're in Brooklyn and I'm in Miami. I don't know.
Might be.
I know, right? But I have felt that the third wave of feminism kind of bypassed the womanhood, right? And I thought the third wave of feminism should have been the mother's liberation movement, and the mother's let's say focused on motherhood, and instead it kind of gave patriarchy permission to allow everyone. It gave patriarchy permission to allow everyone, so long as they're not mothers, to be to enter feminism as women, right? So I don't know. I think that there are definitely the interests of billions of women in the world that feminists have forgotten in this pursuit of making women equal to men in the workplace. But the price that is condoning, that we paid, was condoning this devaluation, fragmentation of the motherhood, the work of procreation, separating mother and child from basically from the egg stage, with egg donors, to the birth stage, surrogacy, and and so on and so forth, and making all that normal in the name of feminism. Just seems in exchange for money, so in exchange for a job that women get to do, or for money, for surrogacy, and it just seemed all of it is, is morally dubious to me. There is a part of me that feels that we're being co-opted because we got we kind of like got stuck in the definition of gender, which is the social, right, the cultural gender, and haven't like moved forward to like the motherhood part of womanhood, basically. And the word woman now is moot, right? So it can be a trans man. That's not what yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wonder how that connects to, the sort of critique of the third wave as being too white focused, too focused on white people, and not,
and all these
not embracing people of color.
And like all these fights. I mean, I don't know. I left academia. You are, bravely still in it, and wisely, but both. but like fighting over minute differences in like lexicon and discourse.
Yeah, I do think language is really important, of course, because as a writer, I definitely think that's really important. But the it can be really hard to. I mean, I think we're fighting with each other instead of fighting the patriarchy, because the use of the is really sometimes hard. And then I think when there's so much of a focus on not actually looking for the right language necessarily, but using the language that has been sanctioned. I think that leads to a lot of jargon, and it leads to a lot of then eventually that word doesn't mean anything. Like, what does the word privilege mean right now? Like, we use that word so often, it's starting to lose the meaning that we needed it to have in the beginning. Or, that I just think that happens a lot, and we have to, it's partly the writer's job to keep refining the language and keep asking questions and keep saying, well, what does this word really mean? What are we doing with it? I mean, that's where academia can sometimes be like the church, in that it's and a dogma. And I think it's the writer's, the artist's job to ask the questions, and not, ask the questions and sort of, poke at the dogma and make us rethink things.
So what do you think, like, the place of, writing is in our culture now? What do you think is happening? I mean, it's so changed from when, like, when you and I first met, let's say.
Yeah.
Until now.
By writing, what do you mean? Do you mean literature, or do you mean just being everybody being able to write and communicate something?
Well, I think they've become indistinguishable, right? Because who can tell what literature is anymore? Like
I guess I guess I'm thinking, I'm thinking partly as a professor, like our creative writing students have plenty of work because there's so much writing that is needed in the world right now, like just professionally. There's to be able to, because of the internet and social media, there's such a need for people who can communicate and think about communication. But I think that's different from poetry and novels and usually, I mean, I guess there are people who use social media to write poems sometimes, but usually they're different categories. I think, honestly, literature is a place where a lot of people are going for this spiritual, or what people used to go to looking for, when people were looking for meaning in, when somebody, in grief or in any kind of major life transition, when people used to go to the church just automatically.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, as I was saying before, I think that impulse is still there in most people. But I think I think now for some people that has moved to literature. This is sort of a cliche at this point, but how many times have you heard the poet Mary Oliver quoted in some kind of spiritual context? That is particularly that one line, which I probably can't, I'm not going to get right, but what will you do with your one wild, what is it? Wild and anyway, I don't have the lines, but it's she's quoted a lot. I think that for serious literature, maybe that's always been the case, that there's been this connection between spiritual longing and wanting to read, and just to kind of reframe your, as a way to think through what's happening in your life, how to make sense of your loss, how to make sense of the changes that are going on, how to make sense of the world, how to make sense of your relationship to your neighbor, all of those things. Yeah. But I'm not saying it's, doing great. I'm not saying, that I think that's probably a small percentage of the population that is reading that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I just feel that, writers' relationship to writing has changed so much, and that, again, where I came from, before I came to America, there was no way to get paid for your writing. So it was kind of like a non sequitur. Like if you, unless you had some sort of family support, you would get a job and write, at night or something. So again, it's only like a symptom of the last, since the 50s, I guess, and the GI Bill especially. And meanwhile, we're reading more than ever. I mean, if you add into it, the stuff that people read in the, in the news sites and on their emails and the, newsletters and whatever, all the apps, on top of reading books and then listening to books, and right. So, nevertheless, it seems to all, it seems to all want to make a difference very consciously, in a way that it wasn't so loudly proclaimed before, and not make a difference in reality. So it feels to me like a lot of wading in circles in water. So it's interesting. It's interesting. I think that's the moment that we're in, and it feels like it's kind of like that we're at the crossroads. But hopefully. Yeah. So you're working on another. Your son now you mentioned is an adult, so he's going to college, which is a huge moment in a mother's life.
Yes. He's going to college in 2 months.
Yeah.
I haven't quite wrapped my head around it. Speaking of major life changes. He's going to college, and he's a wonderful young man. He's curious, very I would say very emotionally intelligent. And I'm excited. On the one hand, I'm very excited for him to be, I've been having these longings to go back to college myself. And on the one hand, I'm very excited for him. And on the other hand, of course, I'm sad.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
How did you find that when your daughter went to college? And by the way, he's going to the same college that your daughter went to.
That's great. Well, I love that. So that's a good place. It was hard. It was it was just it definitely feels, it registers on the psychic level like a loss, So like you and I both lost our fathers this year, and or within the year, and that's a huge loss. But the way that I process it is similar because it's kind of a day-to-day thing, So I miss my dad day to day a lot, but I keep, I don't quite understand what it means that I'll never see him again.
Yeah.
So with my daughter, I missed her equally a lot. And I knew it was part of my job to just like leave her alone, right? But I mean, she'd never even gone to camp. We always vacationed together. So we had been inseparable.
Wow.
Other than like a couple of sleepovers she had with local friends here, because her friends wanted to come to our house always. So basically we were, inseparable. I was a single mom. So it was a, big psychic shock to the system, because I had made that a priority. So my life choices kind of revolved around her for, 18 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, in a way they still do, but it's just a different, lifestyle. Like, so life had to change.
And did you feel like you were somehow, I guess one question I have is, will I feel, I'm wondering if some of my sense of freedom and just the way I thought of myself before I became a mother, I wonder if that's going to be coming back, or if it's just going to be a completely different thing. I mean, for me, initially it came back, like I immediately started the podcast, and I was like able to talk about sex again, which I had, I had self-censored all these years because I didn't want like other parents and kids to, in some way, like, whatever. Just discriminate against my baby. Of course.
So that definitely happened. It was like almost, adolescent in like, oh, Me Too just happened and I'm like home alone and I get to do this. But, it's they are, they're very present. So there's always, like in my head, I thought, oh, I'll just go, back to how things were. But of course I can't, because she needs to have a place to go to for vacations. She needs to have a place where her staff lives and where her like dogs live and where, right? So for her own like sanity, I need to keep holding the same fort that, otherwise like I would just, like dissolve. So I don't know when that happens, and when that's no longer needed, if ever. I don't know. I'm finding that out in real time. I thought,
right.
We're needed
it's
much
process.
more. Yeah, it's a slow process, and this generation is, like our generation, or at least the friends I have had, couldn't wait to leave home and like never go back. Visit, but like never. But this generation is not like that. So, all of her friends, they all kind of like are very, attached to home and homebound, and then COVID exacerbated that even more with the lockdowns. So, and I don't believe in legal marriage, so I don't even want her to get married. I mean, she'll do whatever she wants, but my point is, I don't even know, like, looking in the future, in the old days, one would say, well, she's going to get married, and have her family, and now I'm like, well, I don't really wish that for her, so I don't know. It's just unknown how things will change.
Yeah. Well, which I guess is exciting.
Yeah, it's nice. I do think it's wonderful. They were not like repeating the same old, like tropes of the past. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. I feel very close to my son too, and I think that I hope we'll continue to have that closeness even as he goes off to college. And
yeah. And I too, thought of going back to. I mean, I have been thinking about it.
Really?
Yeah.
I've just been sort of fantasizing about like how fun it would be to be like in seminars again. And,
Me too.
Just exploring. I mean, you could tell from all of the things I said, I guess, today, like I'm interested in all of these big areas of thought that I want to learn more about. And, I'm coming at them from the perspective of a writer. So I have, all my reading and writing experience behind me, but I haven't fully explored a lot. I still want to learn a lot. So
me too.
So when you go to visit these colleges and you see all the things that you could study, and all these wonderful professors that your child might get to study with, it's hard not to be envious.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. No, I've been thinking. I mean, I haven't actually applied to it, so I haven't gone that far.
I think you'll get in.
I know, but I'm thinking like, philosophy, divinity school. I mean,
divinity school. I'm very attracted to divinity school.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe we'll end up classmates.
Exactly. Oh. Okay, life goals. We're gonna be roommates in college. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, good. So this was nice, and I think we covered a lot, and we managed to come to a happy ending.
Right.
Of like
an open ending, anyway.
Yeah, I have an open ending of like promise and and hope.
Yeah. And questions, and asking lots of questions.
Yeah. So thank you.
Well,
thank you for
coming. Thank you. It was so much just a pure joy to talk to you, as always.
As always. You too, as always. And everyone out there, thank you for staying with us one more week. And until next week, keep speaking sex. If I could make love incessantly, I would be God.